So thank you very much for the invitation to come and talk here. My name is Peter Lewis. I'm at Ontario Tech University just outside Toronto in Canada. I really liked what Liselott said in the last talk, that this was challenging and interesting to come up with something to talk about today. This is not a normal place where I would come and present. So I was really actually quite welcome for the challenge to think about how to kind of contextualize what I do think about in the context of the scope of this workshop, and that was really interesting. So my background is in artificial intelligence, and I've gone through in my career, I suppose, working in a field that nobody really cared about because it was just sci-fi or something really niche, to something that suddenly is everywhere all over the world and seems to be permeating every field and every product, and that's been quite interesting, and it got me thinking. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about digital public spaces, and how spaces are being reimagined in the digital transformation, how artificial intelligence shows up in those places, and how we might want to think differently about those. But first, I'm going to actually start with a story about place. And this was one of the first things that came to my mind when I started thinking about this. This is a photo from a protest that I helped to organize when I was an undergraduate student. And I was an undergrad in the UK at the time when tuition fees were introduced in England for the first time ever, I think, in the United Kingdom. And there was a huge outcry over a number of years from student groups and others. And this is just an example of the kind of thing we used to get up to. We used to go, this was in London somewhere, I think, and I helped to organise this. And we also used to organise them locally as well. And this is another photo of the town where I went to college. And I remember this street very well because we organised a march along this street. There's a bunch of students, and we had a note of fees banners, and we were talking to random passers-by trying to do their shopping about what we were doing and why we thought that tuition fees in universities were a really bad idea. And we had a lot of fun doing it. And one day we walked up here, and then we walked along into this square that you can see from here. And immediately a bunch of security guards turned up and told us to stop. And I was like, well, why? We're just having a protest. And I know the laws are very different now in England, but the thing that they informed us about was that this row of bollards here, behind that row of bollards, this thing that looks like a public square is actually not a public square at all. It's a private space owned by a shopping centre. And our right to protest stopped at the line of bollards, and we could do it on the street, but if we stepped over there, then we'd be potentially guilty of trespass for being on this place. So this looks like a public square, but in fact it isn't. And the affordances that you get from this with respect to what we were trying to do were quite different either side of that line. So this is just a little bit of a story, a bit of an introduction. Obviously, protest is still very relevant, acknowledging that COP27 is happening at the moment, probably unlikely again to create any meaningful change. Acknowledging also that, as you can see on the right here, students still today have legitimate grievances when it comes to how they're treated by governments. I think it's not hard to make the case for why the right to self-organisation is both essential to democracy, perhaps our survival, and how it's important that the spaces that we create provide the affordances to be able to do that. So that's really the kind of context that I want to sort of set for this. Obviously, public spaces are not just about protest. That's an obvious example that I can use to kick us off. But more broadly, they're about spaces for community building and self-organisation in order to take collective action in our own interest, right? And I know we had some discussion around bottom-up change and things in the previous panel discussion. Some more examples. So here's one. This is a citizens' assembly that was organised in North Wales. And there's some people who were involved in this. And for those that aren't familiar, I mean, these are kind of deep democracy exercises that bring people together to really listen and understand to different perspectives in order to be able to hopefully solve kind of wicked problems that affect us all. This particular one brought together local farmers, young people, families, senior citizens, shopkeepers. And you can see it was also run bilingually as well. A lot of the farmers in North Wales only speak Welsh or don't speak English very well. And this was a real exercise in trying to bridge that barrier as well. So one more example of a public space where this kind of community self-organisation can happen and make change. a totally different example. This one's from a village just outside Brikama in the Gambia. And one of the things that they do here, and I have some friends here, is they reserve the shady spot under the trees outside of the village for community meetings in order to be able to come together to deliberate and make decisions that affect all of them and listen to each other. So just some examples. So here's my question, right? So what happens when we move community self-organization to the digital world? The digital world seems to be replacing simultaneously both public spaces, I would argue. We're all sitting here on Zoom right now. Meetings, web presences, we have Twitter discussions, and also, as I sort of hinted at the end, the medium where this discourse actually takes place, WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups, Twitter, things like that. So this is actually the flyer from that Citizens Assembly that took place in North Wales, just in Denbigh. And you can see again, it's bilingual. It's hosted at the Arianfa Centre, which is Welsh for ice cream parlour, which is the name of the community centre in this particular town. It used to be an ice cream parlour. And it was sponsored by a shop called Tiguru, which means the greenhouse. And it's interesting because although this took place in a very public space, supported by local government, national government, what happens when we move this online? Well, look where the arrows are pointing. Suddenly, instead of being in a community space, we're on Instagram and Facebook. And if you didn't know, that's the same company. And that's the place, that's the alternative. That's the digital version of the space where this People's Assembly was taking place. So what does that mean? That was kind of really one of the things that almost triggered me when I saw this. I thought, this seems like something's a little bit awry here, and smacks of my experience trying to go into what I thought was a public square back in Stourbridge. I did a little bit of looking around where I live and some of the community groups around here, and almost exclusively their primary digital presence is Facebook. Common Ground Community Garden. I live in North Oshawa. You can see the North Oshawa Community Group has 5,000 of us are on Facebook discussing things that matter to us. And this is typical. I'm sure you've all experienced. The answer is when you sign up with the group, it's join our Facebook group, get on our WhatsApp group, join our Discord server, get on our Slack channel, our Twitter space. These are all private spaces. And so I'd like to argue that I think Facebook and others, they're a little bit like shopping malls, shopping centres. Lots of teenagers choose to meet their friends in shopping centres. They're a place where you can go and meet your friends and have discussions. But the purpose of the place is something else. The purpose of the place is actually to sell you things. And it only really exists because of that. So it's the shopping centre, it's not the town square. So this is the privatization, the corporatization of the internet, which I'm sure is probably not very new as an idea to a lot of people. And I was going to make a slide all about explaining the impact of this. And actually, I decided I would just copy and paste these pictures because it was just too much of a gift. So if you've been following the news about what's happening with Twitter at the moment, one of these big places for discourse, this is a private text chat between Jack Dorsey, who's the founder of Twitter, and Elon Musk, who's the world's richest person who has just bought Twitter. And you can see the conversation they're having here. So, Dorsey's saying, this should never have been a company. It should have been a protocol. That was the original sin. For what it's worth, I agree with him. Elon Musk wants to help. Do you have a moment to chat? About to head out to dinner. Let's talk later. Dorsey's got some more ideas about, how he thinks it ought to be. Elon Musk, super interesting idea, right? So, what do we make of a conversation like this? I mean, when I see this, I think, well, maybe there's some good ideas there, but fundamentally, this tells me that the health of our online spaces, they're dependent on the whims, ideas, goodwill of a small number of highly privileged people. This is a chat between two billionaires that will influence the space in which we carry on discourse. This has actually been studied in geography. I found this paper by Zook and Graham, which is fascinating, talking about how they liken the dominance of the corporate internet today with the enclosures of rural England, which was, if you've studied English history, is something that took many centuries and essentially led to the eradication of the commons and the enclosure of privatized farming land, which was a cause of major civil strife. There was a very organized protest movement for generations, actually, that followed this. And there's a lot of evidence now that it led to an increase in inequality. And one of the phrases I read was that England was better off, but the people of England were not. So I think that's an interesting comparison to make when we think about the early origins of the internet and where things have gone. What are the risks of private digital spaces? So, I'm arguing that there are risks to this kind of thing for self-organization. A couple of examples here, just to continue the Twitter one. Examples in both Pakistan and Turkey, where the government requested Twitter to block certain pieces of content. Even in the case of Turkey, Twitter blocked it despite an order from the country's highest court saying that it should not be blocked on the basis of freedom of expression. Twitter went ahead and did it anyway. Another example of blasphemous, so-called blasphemous tweets in Pakistan on the request of a bureaucrat there. So these are the kind of power that these companies hold. And essentially what I'm arguing is that there is therefore a kind of lack of sovereignty over these spaces that secures them for us to be able to do that self-organization. Okay, so what's all this got to do with AI? I said I'm an AI person, and I am, and I'm interested in AI and how it shows up in these places, because increasingly it does. And I think the simple answer is that, we often think now about both digital and physical spaces being somehow smart, right? Or intelligent spaces, intelligent platforms. Notwithstanding that sometimes the smart in these things is not very smart at all. It's just some quite simple rule-based thing or some straightforward kind of algorithm or a bit of programming. But often they're presented as if it's smart, and it's kind of, I think we've written before about how there's a kind of a power play going on here when that happens. But yeah, so these places, they contain AI increasingly, and I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit with this, but there are some really obvious places where this AI has been used extensively. So largely, and I've chosen Facebook here as an example. The purpose of the AI is to keep our attention and to sell us things, or to persuade us to give up information, so that can be sold to other people who can then better sell us things. And there's a quote I've put on here from the Forbes article that says exactly that. Builds its business by learning about its users, packaging their data for advertisers, and then reinvents this to show us new useful functionality, which it then uses to learn even more about us. So this is the purpose for the AI in these systems often. There's other things as well, but fundamentally, I think this is where it comes down to. Even a generous interpretation of this, I would argue, still requires us to see essentially the interest of a person engaging with one of these platforms in terms of their individual economic interest, and not in terms of the interest, for example, of a community. So how much energy has been put into this intelligence? And here's my real question. This is what I'm interested in, is what might AI that's aimed instead at growing and strengthening communities look like? How might we do that? And the point I really want to kind of come to is that, we're on the back foot with this, right? So as a whole research community, as a technical community interested in solving some of these problems, we're on the back foot. We've got defensive things we can do. So we can use Signal instead of WhatsApp. We can work on projects. I can give projects to students that expose bias in machine learning models. We can challenge design assumptions like I've been doing a little bit here. But all these things are essentially defensive. So there are risks to self-organization on online platforms that are privatized like this. But I think there's also a missed opportunity, because we could be doing better if we didn't have to be defensive all the time. But we could be inventing new, interesting and empowering things. So I want to talk a little bit about what some of those might be. And I've got a couple of examples here just from our own projects that I'm going to talk about at a very high level. So the question I want to ask is, what if we could design spaces with the principles and mechanisms to support what I call deep cooperation, social action? And I think this is reminiscent of Ober, right? So talking about, institutions of democracy can solve public action problems. But and number two is perhaps most important here, mechanisms for coordination based on common knowledge. And that's the kind of thing that I think we're missing in the AI that we conceive of today, certainly in the corporate world. So this does require sovereignty over space, or security of that. But I think it also involves people like me coming up with new creative ways of reimagining what smart might mean, what AI might mean for these kind of platforms once we have that sovereignty. So here's two ideas. I'm going to talk about them very briefly at a high level. I'm happy to talk in more detail, but just want to kind of give a flavor. So one of them is around building and sustaining social capital. And this is something we've been working on with an organization in Toronto called the Pomoja Institute, who are a community action group based in the Black community, who really kind of did a lot of really excellent work during the COVID lockdowns around public health information. There was a lot of distrust around public health information around vaccines, as the example shows here. And what they did was they built an app actually called Auntie Betty, who's a kind of virtual aunt, and you could kind of chat anonymously with Auntie Betty to ask questions about this. And there were a whole load of Auntie Bettys behind the thing who were registered nurses and were able to give informed information to people. And this they did some absolutely brilliant things during this. But one of the things that's particularly interesting was that the networks that emerged from this. So what they realized, and what we've kind of realized as we've mapped some of this, is you have these number of kind of aunties in this community, and each one of them is connected to and supporting particular people within the community. But then what you get is you get these kind of ring shapes of the aunties themselves. So you've got a kind of ring model and then a kind of spokes model coming off that. And this kind of pattern of community we saw quite a lot with the users of this app. So this, I think, is interesting and somewhere where we could potentially target some AI to help us to strengthen community further. Right? They've now moved on to, post-COVID, to actually looking at food security and have just won a grant from the Registered Nurses Foundation of Ontario. I'm very happy that to build this out, to try and tackle food security within their communities. I've put a quote up here from Amanda Otley, the director of the Institute. She talks about the solution to food security is not more food banks. Right? It's communities that are empowered to be able to address their own food security. And essentially what she thinks we can do, and this is where we're working together, is to try and use what she's calling socially conscious computing to build social capital that can empower communities to address this for themselves. So here's my question as an AI person. Can we use technology to build the kind of resilient communities, to build the social capital that's needed for these groups to be able to support themselves? So those are the kind of questions, and she talks then about using this as networks that can actually agitate for change as well, taking it a step further. So I put up a little bit here about what social capital is, but essentially, there's lots of discussion about this. We don't have time to talk about it today. But this is around the social networks that exist and the norms of reciprocity and trustworthiness that exist on those social networks. So I'm going to focus really specifically on the shape of networks. And we have, according to social capital theory, there's at least 3 different types of this. Linking social capital, bonding social capital, and bridging social capital. I'm going to focus on bonding social capital and bridging. And bonding is essentially thick, dense networks where there's a lot of resilience and a lot of mutual support. And bridging social capital is connections that actually create strengths between different subgroups, right? So stretching between different subgroups in order to be able to make broader, longer links. So I wondered if we could do something like that with these networks, right? So here's an example of a network we might have had. So what happens when a new auntie comes in and wants to be part of this community and wants to help, right? So think about recommender systems saying, you might like to do this. Instead of thinking about your individual interest, how about say, well, actually, we think, it would be good for the community if you were connected in this way, right? And then, for example, this can lead to more resilience and strength of social capital here. This might be an example of bonding social capital. This is quite simplistic, but hopefully you can see where I'm going. So then we've got a new person who comes over here, maybe with their own network. And actually what we want to do at this point is, can we have a system that sort of says, well, actually, we've identified the network is disjoint at this point, and I wonder if there's a way that we can find a link like this in order to create some bridging social capital and to be able to link these together and strengthen the community further. So this is just one of the ideas of the kind of thing that I think that we ought to be able to think about using AI to be able to support the growth of these kinds of networks in an intentional way, instead of just connecting people with, adverts that might sell them more things, for example. The second one, very briefly, I've just got one slide. I want to talk a little bit about what you can then do with those networks. And I think, deeper cooperation is one of them. So I spent quite a bit of time studying the evolution of cooperation in sort of evolutionary computation and modeling. And this is something that's very well studied. But I think one of the things that these studies often miss is that, I think we touched on this in the discussion, the models for this are often so simplistic that they really miss the human element of the cooperation that's there. And they almost treat humans like they're bacteria that kind of are sort of somehow kind of coming together in order to make very kind of in the moment decisions. It's like a very ecological model of humans. So these models typically contain minimal cognition, very much in the moment decision. There's not really any social context in the kind of, take something like a prisoner's dilemma, for example. And so it's no surprise that under those kind of ecological assumptions, these defection-based strategies prevail, and we end up with tragedies of the commons all over the place. I don't think that's a surprise, but actually we know that humans do more than that. We know that they use their cognitive capabilities, to create institutional norms, change the rules of the game, motivate acts that create outcomes that they desire in their interests of the community. So again, coming back to the AI, how can we create platform intelligence, if you like, that can support humans to do that at scale? And I know that obviously Jeremy's been working on sort of some of the specifications for these kinds of things, but I think there's some real questions about how you build these out, how they evolve, how you ensure that they're sustainable in a kind of dynamic community setting. My personal belief is that I think this requires reflection. I think it requires agents that are able to learn models of their social situation in order to make these kind of recommendations, perhaps predicting how that network or the norms on that network would evolve, and then being able to act intentionally in order to create the right kind of incentive structures, for example, to achieve the outcomes that the community are in the community's interest. So that's the second idea, just something that I think we could reimagine AI in a different way to do things in a community interest rather than necessarily in the interests of individuals and their economic needs. So just to wrap up, my point really is that the digital transformation of place is threatening the existence of public spaces. We are building shopping centres, not community centres, and I think this both limits the value of them and it poses risks. The AI that then exists within that obviously serves the owners of those places, and I would argue that it individualizes and dehumanizes, and it doesn't collectivize or empower, and I think that's what we should be doing. So we are on the back foot. We tend to adopt a defensive stance, mitigating the worst, perhaps, of what we see around us from big tech and AI. But I'd like to kind of invite us all to try and imagine an alternative, sort of smart, intelligent, public digital space that we can use to enable social action. I'd love to talk with anybody who wants to do that with me, but I think I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.